It used to be that chickens were only kept by people living out on farms, but today keeping chickens pretty much anywhere they can fit has become really popular. So how did it end up this way? The interest in keeping chickens in the wider public really began during the chicken craze of the mid-1800s, which I have talked about before. Prior to this time, chickens were a small, scrappy kind of animal that didn't really like being kept confined in small spaces. But with the importation of different breeds from China and crossing them into the breeds that already existed, chickens were created that were much more tolerant of being kept in small spaces, so it became possible for people in all sorts of different situations to keep chickens. Another thing that happened in the early 20th century was the understanding of vitamin D, and that might sound like a strange thing to talk about in a video about chickens, but the discovery of vitamin D really helped to keep flocks healthy over the wintertime, because before it was known about, it was really difficult for people to keep their chickens healthy and happy over the wintertime and able to have strong and healthy chicks in the springtime. Because the breeds of chickens had been improved over this time period from the mid-1800s through to the early 20th century, they became a much more useful animal for people to keep. So small farms often kept chickens as a way to make small amounts of cash money from selling eggs and from selling fryers or broilers in the season, and it was often something that the wife and children of the farm could do to just generate some money to spend in the store and little bits and pieces like that. And because the chickens could now tolerate being in smaller spaces, they became viable for anyone to keep to provide eggs and meat just for the household. There was a major increase in the keeping of chickens over the war years, both the First World War and the Second World War. People were encouraged to keep chickens and to grow victory gardens to help with feeding themselves, because the more food people could produce for themselves, the more food could be sent to support the war effort. During this time, governments in the UK, in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, and I'm sure many other countries, encouraged their citizens to really get into growing their own food and keeping chickens. And keeping chickens was really encouraged because chickens can eat scraps. They can eat kitchen scraps, they can eat garden scraps, and they produce, obviously, eggs and meat for the household. And one recipe I found for chicken feed during this war era was to use boiled potato skins mixed with bran as your main chicken feed. So they were a pretty versatile animal to keep to provide food for the household. After the Second World War ended, chickens began the journey towards industrialization, and that meant that chickens began to be cheaper and cheaper to buy, and eggs became cheaper and cheaper to buy. And this really disincentivized keeping your own chickens, because it was just so easy and cheap to go to the supermarket and buy eggs and buy chicken meat, and you were done. So it really fell out of favor to keep chickens in your backyard or on your small farm, because it just wasn't worth it. Big business was doing it much cheaper than anyone could do it. Beginning in the late 70s and moving into the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, people began to become concerned about animal welfare in these industrialized food systems, and they also became concerned about health and safety of food in general. So the interest in keeping chickens in your backyard to produce your own eggs and your own meat began to rise again and become quite popular. And this is the era where organic gardening, farmers markets, the local eating movement, and all of these sorts of things really started to gather steam and form into the organizations that they are today. One really helpful resource was born out of this era, and that is the forum website Backyard Chickens, which is a great wealth of information for anyone looking to find out about keeping chickens in their backyard. Now, the birth of that website was in 1999, and the form that it is in today launched in 2007. Now, by the end of 2008, that website had 19,000 members, and today it has over 500,000 members contributing to the cause of keeping backyard chickens. The interest in growing your own food and keeping chickens just kept on accelerating, but it sort of reached just a normal moving along point, but it dramatically increased in 2020 when we had the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, orders for chicks from hatcheries tripled during this time period, and everyone wanted chickens in their backyard. There was also an issue with egg supply in 2021 running through to 2023 due to bird flu in the Northern Hemisphere and regulatory changes here in New Zealand, and that helped to keep that interest really high in having backyard chickens. Once you've had a flock of chickens in your backyard, it's really hard to stop having them, and chicken meth is a thing. So I really see that this movement of helping to provide some of your own food is going to continue on into the future. And with these uncertain economic times that we're living in, I just see a positive future for chickens and gardening in everyone's backyard all around the world.